The slap cracked through the emergency room louder than the monitor's steady beeping. It was a sharp, dry sound, cold enough to make everyone in the room stop breathing for a moment. Dr. Malcolm Hargrove didn't just bark at the quiet nurse. He hit her. His hand flew out and struck Autumn Hayes so hard her head snapped to the side. But he didn't stop there. He reached forward, fist closing around a handful of her auburn hair, and yanked her backward. "Know your place, little girl," he hissed, his face flushed red with fury. "You're nothing in this hospital. An orphan raised in filth thinks she can talk back to me?" The entire room turned rigid. The other nurses looked away, waiting for Autumn to cry. They thought the shy, soft-spoken girl would beg for forgiveness. But Autumn didn't cry. Her jaw locked tight. Her green eyes flared with a cold, steady fire. Dr. Hargrove believed he was the most powerful man in the building. He had billionaire friends, senators in his phone. He believed he could treat a poor nurse like trash, and no one would dare do a thing. He was wrong. He had just made the biggest mistake of his life. To the staff at St. Catherine's Hospital, Autumn was nobody. She was the nurse who took the hardest shifts, did the dirtiest work without a single complaint. She spoke so little that most people forgot she was even there. She looked like someone afraid of her own shadow. But there was one man standing in the darkness of the emergency room. A man who knew the truth. Cade Blackwood, the cold-blooded boss of the Blackwood Syndicate, the most powerful mafia organization on the east coast of the United States, stood motionless as a statue. He wore a black suit that cost more than Hargrove earned in a year. The tattoos along his neck and hands told a story of violence and absolute power. He didn't move, not even an inch, but his steel-gray eyes were locked on Hargrove's hand, the hand still tangled in Autumn's hair. 6 months earlier, Autumn had found Cade bleeding out in a dark alley in South Boston after a failed hit. She didn't call the police. She didn't run. She knelt in the rain and saved his life while his enemies were still hunting him. Hargrove thought he was a god because he had a medical degree and wealthy friends. He was about to learn that a title meant nothing when you insulted the woman a mafia boss had sworn to protect. The surgeon thought he was about to destroy the life of a nurse. He didn't realize that the man in the suit had already decided Hargrove would never walk out of this hospital as a free man again. If you want to know how the mafia boss will take revenge, please hit like to support this video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next gripping stories. And if this story touched you, please share it so it can reach even more people. Cade didn't move. His gray eyes stayed locked on Hargrove's hand, the hand still fisted in Autumn's auburn hair. But beneath that ice-cold exterior, a storm was gathering. He tilted his head slightly to one side, a motion so small it was almost impossible to notice. But Silas noticed. The tall man standing a few steps away understood at once. He eased back, dissolving into the shadowed hallway without a sound. Seconds later, men in black suits began to shift. They didn't run, and they didn't rush. They simply fanned out in silence, taking up positions with quiet precision. The main doors of the emergency room, the fire exit, the stairwell, the elevators, one way out after another, each one sealed off by wordless, dark figures. No one in the emergency room realized what was happening. They were still too busy being afraid of Hargrove. The surgeon finally released Autumn's hair. He shoved her, sending her stumbling back a few steps. But Autumn didn't fall. She held her ground, spine straight, eyes fixed on the man who had just humiliated her. That only fueled Hargrove's rage. He hated defiance. He hated that a small, insignificant nurse dared not bow her head to him. "Who do you think you are?" Hargrove hissed, his face still flushed. "You think you can talk back to me and still keep your job?" He stepped closer to Autumn, stabbing a finger toward her face. "Listen to me, girl. I've got friends in places you can't even imagine. Senator Pemberton plays golf with me every week. This hospital's board? Half of them owe me favors. You know what that means?" Autumn didn't answer. She just stood there, silent, jaw still clenched. "It means," Hargrove went on, his voice thick with contempt, "I can make you disappear from medicine with a single phone call. No hospital in this city will touch you. No one will dare. You'll crawl back to the trash, right where you belong." He turned to the other nurses, trembling nearby. "And you?" he roared. "Anyone who opens their mouth about what happened tonight will share her fate. You hear me?" No one dared respond. They only lowered their heads, avoiding Hargrove's gaze the way you avoided the eyes of death itself. Hargrove seemed satisfied with that. He adjusted the collar of his white coat as if he'd just completed a flawless operation. Then he pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number right in front of everyone. "Richard," he said into the receiver, his tone turning suddenly warm. "I've got a small problem to handle. A nurse who doesn't know her place. Can you give me a hand?" He chuckled. A smug, self-satisfied sound. "Good. I knew you wouldn't say no." Hargrove ended the call, cast one last victorious look at Autumn, and turned away. He walked off, his heavy steps echoing against the tiled floor. He thought he'd won. He thought he'd just crushed an ant beneath his heel. He had no idea that, from the dark corner of the emergency room, a pair of gray eyes was still tracking his every step. Cade Blackwood stood perfectly still, his face empty of expression. But in his mind, a sentence had already been passed. Hargrove believed he was the predator. He didn't know he had just made himself prey, and the trap had snapped shut long ago. Autumn walked out of the emergency room with her back straight and her chin lifted. She wouldn't allow herself to crumble in front of them. Not in front of Hargrove, not in front of the co-workers who had looked away when she needed them most. Her footsteps rang evenly along the empty corridor, each step an effort to keep her legs from trembling. Only when the locker room door closed behind her, only when she was completely alone inside four cold walls, did Autumn allow herself to stop. She faced the old mirror bolted to the wall and looked at her own reflection. The red bruise on her left cheek was already deepening into purple. Her auburn hair, torn and yanked, still sat in a tangled mess. But what held her attention wasn't the damage on the outside. It was the green eyes staring back at her from the glass. Those eyes didn't cry. They had forgotten how to cry a long time ago. Autumn lifted a hand to touch the bruise, and suddenly she wasn't standing in Street Catherine's locker room anymore. She was standing at the iron gate of Holy Grace Orphanage, 27 years earlier. People said she'd been found there on a freezing winter night, wrapped in a thin blanket, only 3 days old. No name, no address, not a scrap of paper to explain why someone would abandon a newborn in the dead of winter. The nuns had named her Autumn, because that night was the last night of the fall season. Autumn grew up among other orphans, but she never belonged there. She was too small, too fragile, too easy a target. The older kids bullied her every day. They hid her food, tore up her school books, locked her in a pitch-black closet for hours at a time. She remembered nights curled tight on a battered bunk bed, biting her lips so hard she wouldn't let a sound of crying escape, because crying only made things worse. Crying only showed them she was weak. And in that place, weakness meant death. No one adopted her. No one wanted a thin, quiet child with eyes that always stayed fixed on the floor. Autumn left the orphanage the day she turned 18, with a torn backpack and $40 in her pocket. She took whatever work she could find, washing dishes in a diner, mopping floors in a supermarket, babysitting for families who couldn't afford a professional sitter. She worked by day and studied by night. She studied in damp, rented rooms, under streetlights spilling through the window, with old textbooks bought from secondhand shops. It took her 6 years, 6 long, grinding years, to finish nursing school and earn the first diploma of her life. That diploma was hanging now in her small apartment. It was the only thing she allowed herself to be proud of. It was proof that she had survived. The creak of the locker room door pulled Autumn back into the present. She turned, instinct tightening every muscle in her body. But the person who stepped inside wasn't Hargrove. It was Janet Lewis, the only coworker who ever spoke to her for more than 3 sentences a day. Janet closed the door behind her, eyes reddened as if she'd been crying. "Autumn," Janet whispered, her voice shaking. "Oh God, your face." "I'm fine," Autumn said, so calm it surprised even her. "I've been through worse." Janet moved closer and took Autumn's hand. Her palm was warm, so different from the cold Autumn had grown used to. "I'm sorry," Janet said, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I should have said something. I should have done something. But I was terrified." Autumn shook her head. "Don't apologize. You've got a family to think about. I understand." "You don't," Janet said, her tone turning suddenly grave. She glanced around as if she feared someone might be listening. "Hargrove isn't just any doctor, Autumn. He's connected to Senator Pemberton. They play golf every week. They have dinner together every month. Pemberton's been protecting Hargrove for 10 years. Anyone who dares to go after Hargrove disappears. Not disappears in the literal sense, but their careers disappear. Their lives get destroyed. Some people lose their homes, lose their families, lose everything." Autumn looked at Janet, her face still unreadable. "You're saying I should be afraid?" "I'm saying you should be careful," Janet said, gripping her hand tighter. Hargrove won't stop here. He'll retaliate. And with the connections he has, he can do whatever he wants. Autumn turned back to the mirror and met her own green eyes. She had survived hell. She had dragged herself out of the dark with her own hands. She didn't know that somewhere out there, a man was looking in her direction too. A man who wouldn't let anyone lay a hand on her ever again. A black SUV sat in the shadows of the hospital parking lot, about 50 meters from the main entrance. Inside, Cade Blackwood sat motionless, like a statue carved from stone. His gray eyes stared through the tinted window, fixed on the bright building ahead. He'd been like that for 20 minutes since leaving the emergency room, not speaking, not shifting, not moving a single muscle. Silas sat in the driver's seat, silent, waiting. He'd worked for Cade long enough to know that when his boss went quiet like this, it was when he was most dangerous. Silas. Cade's voice finally cut through the stillness, low and cold, like steel striking steel. Yes, boss. Malcolm Hargrove. Cade released the name one word at a time, as if it were something filthy he didn't want to keep in his mouth any longer than necessary. Keep eyes on him 24/7. I want to know where he sleeps, what he eats, who he meets, who he talks to. Find every secret he's hiding, every single one. Silas nodded, asking nothing. Anything else, boss? Cade didn't answer right away. He looked down at his own hands, long fingers marked with black ink running along each knuckle. These hands had killed. These hands had built an entire underground empire. But 6 months ago, these hands had nearly gone cold in a dark alley in South Boston, if not for her. 6 months. 6 months since that rain-soaked night. Cade had been quietly watching Autumn Hayes. He knew where she lived, a rundown studio in Dorchester with a cheap rent. He knew how many hours she worked every week, usually 60 to 70, taking every shift no one else wanted. He knew how much she owed in student loans, a number heavy enough to bend her shoulders for years to come. He knew she had no family, no relatives, no one in this world except herself. Cade had planned to repay her in his own way, quietly, invisibly. He would pay off her student debt without her ever knowing. He would arrange for her apartment to be repaired, so she'd have a decent place to live. He would make sure her life could breathe a little easier, even if only a little. It would all happen in the shadows, the same way she had saved him in the shadows. That was how Cade Blackwood repaid a debt. No display, no demands, just a debt settled in silence. But tonight, everything had changed. Cade still remembered the exact instant Hargrove's hand swung and the slap echoed through the emergency room. He remembered the way Autumn's head snapped to the side, the way her auburn hair was grabbed and yanked back. He remembered the doctor's contempt as he spat out those insults. And he remembered the most important part. Autumn didn't cry. She stood there with her jaw clenched, her eyes burning with a cold fire, refusing to break in front of the man hurting her. In Cade's world, there was one unbreakable rule. No one was allowed to touch what belonged to him. Autumn Hayes had saved his life. That meant she was inside his circle of protection, whether she knew it or not. And Malcolm Hargrove had committed a sin he would never walk away from. He had dared to lay hands on Cade Blackwood's woman. Silas, Cade said again. And now there was something new in his voice, danger simmering beneath the ice. The old plan is cancelled. We've got a new plan. What's the new plan, boss? Cade turned to look at Silas, gray eyes hard as steel. Hargrove thinks he can do whatever he wants because he's got powerful friends. I'm going to show him what real power is. He paused, his mouth lifting into a smile that never reached his eyes. He'll pay for tonight, penny by penny. 6 months ago. A night of relentless, pounding rain in South Boston. Cade Blackwood lay slumped against a damp brick wall in a dark alley, blood spilling from a deep, gaping wound in his abdomen. The hit had gone wrong. A traitor inside his own organization had sold information to the rival side, and Cade had walked straight into a trap. He'd taken down 3 men before a bullet tore through his hip. He'd made it 2 blocks before his legs stopped obeying him. And now he was here, among garbage and rainwater, waiting for death or waiting for his men to find him, whichever came first. The rain felt like needles on his skin. Cade could feel life draining out of him little by little, carried away in the blood, soaking his clothes. He'd faced death more times than he could count, but it had never felt this close. His vision began to blur. The sounds of the city grew distant, as if they were coming from another world. Then he heard footsteps, not the heavy tread of an assassin, not the hard leather steps of a man. These were light, hurried steps, someone trying to get home before the downpour got worse. Cade forced his eyes open, trying to see who was coming. If it was an enemy, he'd die. If it was a civilian, they'd scream and run to call the police. Either way, tonight would be Cade Blackwood's last night. But what happened next startled him. A woman stopped at the mouth of the alley. She saw him, saw the blood, saw the dangerous darkness that swallowed the scene. Anyone else would have turned and run. Anyone else would have pretended they hadn't seen a thing. But this woman didn't. She ran toward him, small feet splashing through filthy puddles, and dropped to her knees beside him without hesitation. Cade watched her through the curtain of rain, auburn hair plastered to her face, green eyes shining in the dark. She wore a nurse's uniform, and a thin coat that couldn't possibly hold back the rain. She'd just finished a shift, Cade guessed, from the exhaustion etched across her features. But that exhaustion vanished the moment she saw his wound. "Don't talk," she said, her voice strangely calm. "Don't move. I'm not letting you die here." She didn't ask who he was. She didn't ask what had happened. She just moved. Her small hands tore her scarf and pressed it hard against the wound to slow the bleeding. Cade clenched his teeth against the pain, but he didn't make a sound. He watched her work, watched the absolute focus on her face, watched hands that didn't tremble even as blood soaked into every finger. "Too deep," she murmured, not speaking to him so much as to herself. "It needs stitches." And then she did something that made Cade stare. She opened her worn old handbag and pulled out a sealed, sterile suture kit and a small bottle of antiseptic. She carried supplies to treat the homeless who couldn't afford hospitals, Cade realized. She was a healer even off the clock. But tonight, that spool and that needle were going to save his life. She stitched the wound right there in the rain, under the spill of streetlight cutting into the alley. No anesthetic, no medical instruments, just skilled hands and iron determination. Cade bit down hard and endured, his eyes never leaving her face for a single second. He'd met countless people in his life. He'd seen greed, betrayal, fear in their eyes. But he'd never seen this. A complete stranger willing to kneel in rain and blood just to save a man she didn't even know. The sound of a car engine rose from the street. Headlights swept across the alley. Cade's men had finally found him. Silas was the first to jump out, gun in hand, eyes scanning for danger. When he saw the woman kneeling beside his boss, he lifted the gun immediately. "Stop," Cade ordered, his voice weak but still carrying an authority that couldn't be denied. "She saved me." Silas lowered the weapon, but his gaze stayed sharp and wary. The woman didn't panic. She stood, stepped back a few paces, blood smeared on her hands hanging at her sides. She didn't ask who they were. She didn't demand money. She just stood there in the rain as if waiting for permission to leave. Cade tried to sit up, pain ripping through him. He looked at her, straight into green eyes that held not a trace of fear. "What's your name?" he asked. She didn't answer. She only gave a small shake of her head, turned away, and walked into the rain. Her small figure dissolved into the darkness as if she'd never existed at all. Cade watched until she was gone. Then he turned to Silas, and there was something new in his voice, a kind of curiosity he'd never felt before. "Find out who she is," he ordered. "Her name, where she lives, what she does, everything. But don't bother her. Just find out." Silas nodded, asking no questions. That night, as he was taken to a private doctor for treatment, Cade couldn't stop thinking about the woman in the alley. In 36 years, no one had ever helped him without wanting something in return. His world was a world of bargains, debts, blood, paid for with blood. But she, a complete stranger, had given him something money couldn't buy: unconditional kindness. And Cade Blackwood never forgot a debt. The next morning, early sunlight slipped through the heavy curtains of the private office on the top floor of Street Catherine Hospital. Malcolm Hargrove sat behind an expensive oak desk, rolling a silver fountain pen between his fingers, while his eyes stayed fixed on the phone in front of him. A small scratch on the back of his hand, a mark from grabbing Autumn's hair the night before, still stung faintly. But Hargrove didn't feel remorse. He felt anger. Anger that a minor nurse had dared to meet his eyes without lowering her head. Anger that she hadn't cried and begged the way the others did. Anger that her gaze had unsettled him, if only for a moment. Hargrove picked up the phone and dialed the familiar number he'd known by heart for 10 years. The line rang twice before someone answered. "Richard," Hargrove said, his voice sweet as honey, with poison hidden underneath. "I need a favor." Senator Richard Pemberton's voice came through the receiver, low and heavy with authority. "Malcolm, calling this early. What's so serious?" "A nurse," Hargrove ground out. She dared to talk back to me in front of the entire emergency room. She dared to challenge me, Richard. I can't let this go. Pemberton was silent for a moment. He understood Hargrove. They had hidden too many secrets together, buried too many bodies together, both literally and figuratively. Their bond wasn't simple friendship. It was a symbiosis between two monsters. Tell me, Pemberton said. Hargrove told him. He told him about Autumn Hayes, about the nurse who had dared to speak up when he gave an order that broke protocol. He told him about the slap, about grabbing her hair, about the way her eyes refused to drop. The more he spoke, the more his voice shook with fury. She needs to disappear, Hargrove concluded. Not just lose her job. She needs to disappear completely from medicine. I want her to never be able to hold her head up again. Pemberton chuckled softly, a laugh with no warmth in it. Malcolm, you know that isn't difficult for me. I've got people in the FBI, people on the state medical board. How many times have we done this? How many times? Hargrove remembered. He remembered the young nurse 7 years ago, the one who had tried to report him to administration because she suspected he'd been drinking before surgery. She was arrested for drug possession just 1 week later, evidence found in her locker at the hospital. No one believed she was innocent. No one dared to believe it. He remembered the resident 2 years ago, the one who discovered Hargrove had operated on the wrong site and caused a patient's death. The man got into a car accident on his way home, his vehicle veering into the Charles River. No witnesses, no questions. Together they had buried 23 deaths over 10 years. 23 patients had died on Hargrove's operating table because of his mistakes, and 23 families had been paid to stay silent. Pemberton handled everything. He had lawyers, agents, even judges in his grip. Money flowed from black funds into the pockets of those who needed buying, and the truth was buried deep beneath forged paperwork. Autumn Hayes. Pemberton repeated the name as if tasting it on his tongue. Does she have family? Anyone protecting her? No one, Hargrove replied, his contempt plain. She's an orphan. No parents, no relatives, nobody in this world who cares about her. She's a perfect zero. Good, Pemberton said. Then she'll be easy to deal with. I'll have someone fabricate evidence. Drug theft, endangering patients, maybe add a few criminal charges to be safe. She won't just lose her job, she'll lose her freedom. Hargrove smiled, the smile of a man watching prey forced into a corner. Thank you, Richard. I knew I could rely on you. Don't thank me yet, Pemberton said, his voice turning colder. Just make sure she doesn't get a chance to speak. Anyone who stands in our way ends the same, Malcolm. She won't be an exception. Hargrove ended the call and set the phone down on the desk, satisfaction spreading through his chest. He thought he held everything. He thought no one could touch him. He didn't know that somewhere in the city, gray eyes cold as steel were tracking his every move, and the devil's hand he was using was about to be crushed by another hand. 2 days later, Autumn received a message from Human Resources, instructing her to report to Director Howard Mitchell's office at 9 o'clock in the morning. The message was brief and cold, offering no explanation. Autumn knew something was wrong. She'd worked at Street, Catherine Hospital for 3 years, and never once had she been summoned to the director's office. Not once. But she also knew that after that night, after Hargrove's slap and his threats, nothing would ever be the same again. She just hadn't expected it to come this fast. Autumn walked into Director Mitchell's office at exactly 9 o'clock, not a minute early, not a minute late. She wore a clean nurse's uniform, her auburn hair neatly pinned at the nape of her neck, her face calm as it was on any other day. But inside, she'd braced herself for the worst, and the worst was waiting for her on the other side of the door. Mitchell's office was spacious and luxurious, with expensive paintings on the walls and a polished oak desk that took up nearly half the room. But Autumn didn't look at any of it. She looked at the people inside. Director Howard Mitchell sat behind the desk, his face pale, his eyes sliding away as if he couldn't bear to meet hers. Beside him stood 2 men in gray suits, their expressions flat, black leather briefcases in their hands. Lawyers. Autumn recognized them immediately. And in the corner of the room, leaning back against the wall, with a comfort that felt almost obscene, was Malcolm Hargrove. He wore a spotless white coat, and a victorious smile sat on his mouth like he'd just won a very large bet. Miss Hayes, Mitchell began, his voice trembling as if he were the one on trial, not her. Please, have a seat. Autumn didn't sit. She stood straight, arms at her sides, eyes fixed on Mitchell. What is this about, Director? Mitchell swallowed, then glanced at Hargrove as if asking permission. Hargrove gave a small nod, and Mitchell drew a deep breath before opening the thick file in front of him. Miss Hayes, we've received several serious reports regarding your conduct at this hospital. Mitchell read from the page, his voice flat and mechanical. First, you are accused of stealing opioid medication from the pharmacy storage over the past 6 months. The amount missing is estimated at approximately 2,000 doses, linked to a distribution ring. Autumn felt as if someone had punched her in the stomach. I never did that, she said, her voice steady even as her heart slammed like a war drum. This is a frame-up. Mitchell didn't stop. Second, you are accused of endangering a patient by defying the attending physician's orders, specifically Dr. Hargrove's, during an emergency case the night before last. Your actions could have resulted in the patient's death if there hadn't been timely intervention. That's a lie, Autumn said, her voice rising. I objected because the protocol he ordered was wrong. The patient had a documented allergy to that medication. I saved that patient's life. I didn't endanger it. One of the 2 lawyers stepped forward and placed a stack of documents on the desk. We have the patient's medical record, Miss Hayes. There is no notation of any allergy history. You altered the treatment plan without authorization. Autumn stared at the papers, and she understood. They'd changed the record. They'd erased the allergy history. They'd turned her from a lifesaver into a liability. Third, Mitchell continued, his voice shrinking as if he were trying to fold into himself. You are accused of exhibiting signs of mental instability. We have reports from multiple witnesses stating that you've shown aggressive, uncontrolled behavior recently. The medical board recommends that you undergo a mandatory psychiatric evaluation. What witnesses? Autumn asked, her voice turning to ice. Who said that? Confidential information, the second lawyer replied, his tone slick and practiced. You are not entitled to their identities. Autumn turned to Hargrove. He was still standing there, that smile never fading. His eyes gleamed with a cruel satisfaction as he watched her struggle inside the trap he'd built. Do you understand now, Miss Hayes? Hargrove spoke for the first time, his voice so sweet it was nauseating. This isn't personal. This is about protecting patients and the hospital's reputation. I'm only doing what's necessary. Autumn held his gaze without blinking. You know I'm innocent. Hargrove tilted his head, his smile widening. The evidence says otherwise, Miss Hayes. Mitchell cleared his throat and kept reading. The hospital disciplinary board's decision is as follows. Autumn Hayes is suspended without pay, effective immediately. Your nursing license will be forwarded to the state medical board for review and potential permanent revocation. You have the right to appeal within 30 days, but during that time, you are not permitted to set foot in this hospital. Autumn stood there in silence. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She only stood with her back straight and her head high, like a tree refusing to bow in a storm. Security will escort you out, Mitchell said, almost in a whisper. I'm sorry, Miss Hayes. The office door opened, and 2 security guards stepped in. They positioned themselves on either side of Autumn as if she were a dangerous criminal. Then they led her out, through crowded corridors, past coworkers who paused to stare with fear or pity in their eyes. Autumn felt every gaze stabbing into her back. She heard whispers spreading like fire, but she didn't turn around. She wouldn't let them see how much it hurt. Only when the hospital doors closed behind her, only when she stood alone on the sidewalk under harsh sunlight, did Autumn allow her shoulders to sag. She had lost everything. Her job, her reputation, the diploma she'd earned with 6 years of sweat and tears. All of it stolen in a single morning. But Autumn didn't cry. She'd forgotten how to cry a long time ago. She only stood there, looking up at a deep blue sky, and wondered if anything worse was still waiting for her ahead. At the same moment, Autumn stepped out through the hospital gates. Cade Blackwood was sitting in his private office on the top floor of an office building in downtown Boston. The room was spacious, decorated with a stark kind of restraint, black wood and leather furniture, no paintings, no extra ornaments, nothing unnecessary. Like its owner, the space carried a sense of cold and danger. Silas stood in front of Cade with a tablet in his hand, his face darker than usual. "Boss," Silas said, his voice low and tight. "It's worse than we thought." Cade said nothing, only tilted his head slightly, a silent signal for Silas to continue. "Hargrove didn't just suspend her. He's getting ready to push this further." Silas swiped across the tablet, pulling up a series of files and images. "He's got an FBI agent in his pocket, a man named Frank Dobbs. Dobbs has been taking bribes from Pemberton for 5 years, handling their dirty work. And right now, Dobbs is filing paperwork to get an arrest warrant for Autumn Hayes." Cade remained silent, but his gray eyes darkened by a shade. Silas noticed, and he knew a storm was gathering inside his boss. They're going to arrest her on federal charges of trafficking narcotics across state lines and endangering a patient, Silas went on. If she's convicted, she'll do at least 5 years. And with Pemberton's connections in the justice system, she'll have almost no chance to defend herself. Cade lifted a hand and rubbed his temple, a rare gesture that showed he was thinking. Anything else? Silas hesitated for a beat before answering. Yes. We planted a listening device in Autumn's phone last week, like you ordered. Today she got a call. Silas set the tablet on the desk and pressed play. The sound filled the quiet room, every word sharp and clear. First came the ring of a phone, then Autumn picking up. Hello? Then a man's voice. Deep, cold, full of power. The voice of someone used to giving orders and never being refused. Is this Autumn Hayes? Who is this? Richard Pemberton. Senator Richard Pemberton. I believe you've heard my name. Silence from Autumn's end. Then her voice, calm in a way that was almost startling. I know who you are. What do you want? Pemberton let out a soft laugh, a sound like a snake's hiss. I want to give you some advice, Miss Hayes. Free advice from a man with far more experience than you. Disappear. Leave Boston. Leave Massachusetts. Leave the United States if you have to. Don't try to fight what can't be fought. And if I don't take your advice? Pemberton's voice turned colder, sharper, like a blade settling against a throat. Then you'll disappear a different way. You'll disappear, and no one will remember you ever existed. You don't have family. You don't have friends. You don't have anyone in this world who cares about you. You're dust, Miss Hayes, and dust is easy to blow away. The line went silent. Then Autumn's voice came again, slow and measured, one word at a time. I'm not afraid of you. You should be. Pemberton replied. People who don't know fear tend to die young. The call ended. Silas stopped the recording and looked up at his boss. Cade sat perfectly still, but the air in the room suddenly grew heavy enough to choke on. His gray eyes were no longer simply cold. They were burning with a fury Silas had never seen in 10 years of working for Cade. This wasn't loud, careless rage. This was the anger of a predator calculating exactly how it would tear its prey apart. Silas, Cade said, his voice low and level in a way that was terrifying. Call Raymond Pierce. Tell him I need him here within 1 hour, not 2 hours. 1 hour. Yes, boss. And contact Ghost. Cade rose and walked to the window, looking down at the city of Boston stretched out below. Tell him I've got work for him. Big work. I want him digging into everything connected to Hargrove, Pemberton, and that Agent Dobbs. Bank accounts, emails, texts, call logs, everything. I want to know what they've done, what they're doing, and what they're planning to do. Ghost will need time, Silas said. These aren't small targets. Give him 48 hours, Cade replied without turning. Tell him if he does it right, I'll pay double. If he fails, he'll never work for anyone again. Silas nodded and left the room to carry out the orders. Cade stood alone by the window, looking down at the city where he'd built his empire. Pemberton thought he had power. Hargrove thought he was untouchable. They thought they could threaten a woman who had no one to protect her and walk away without consequence. They were wrong. Autumn Hayes had someone. She had Cade Blackwood, and Cade Blackwood never lost. The war had just officially begun, and when it was over, Hargrove and Pemberton would understand there were forces in this world that money and political power couldn't buy, couldn't intimidate, and couldn't stop. 6 in the morning. The Boston sky was still gray and heavy, with no sign of dawn. Autumn lay on the narrow bed in her studio apartment, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. She hadn't slept all night. Pemberton's threat kept echoing in her head like a broken song, looping again and again without mercy. You'll disappear, and no one will remember you ever existed. She knew it wasn't empty talk. She knew men like Pemberton and Hargrove had the power to turn threats into truth. But she didn't run. She didn't know where she would run to. And more than that, she didn't want to run. She'd spent her whole life running from the orphanage, running from poverty, running from the world's contempt. She was tired. If they came to take her, she would face them. And they came. The pounding on the door erupted, violent enough to shatter the early morning silence. It wasn't a polite knock. It was the kind of pounding from people who didn't need permission and didn't intend to wait. FBI, open up. Autumn barely had time to sit up before the apartment door exploded inward, hinges snapping, wood splintering across the floor. They didn't wait for her to open it. They broke it down as if she were a dangerous criminal barricaded inside. 5 men in black jackets with FBI stamped in large letters across their backs stormed into her tiny home. They shouted, guns raised, and sweeping the room as if they were raiding a drug den. Autumn rose from the bed, lifting her hands slowly, careful not to make a sudden move. She knew how arrests like this worked. She knew any resistance would be used as an excuse for worse violence. The man leading them was a middle-aged brute with a rough face and eyes as cold as stone. Agent Frank Dobbs. He stepped up to Autumn and looked her over with open, undisguised contempt. Then he acted, unnecessary, without reason. He only wanted to humiliate her. He grabbed Autumn's arm, twisted her around, and shoved hard. Autumn slammed into the wall, her cheek pressed against cold paint, pain blooming across half her face. Dobbs pinned her there, his knee grinding into her back as if she were trying to run, even though she hadn't moved at all. Autumn Hayes. Dobbs recited her Miranda rights in a slow, deliberate voice, savoring every syllable. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you can't afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. He paused, leaned close to her ear, and dropped his voice into a poisonous whisper. You understand me, girl? No one's going to save you. Autumn didn't answer. She clenched her teeth, swallowing the pain and the humiliation. She felt the handcuffs, icy cold, snap tight around her wrists, metal biting into skin. Dobbs hauled her off the wall, turned her around, and for the first time Autumn saw her apartment through the eyes of intruders. Her studio was barely 20 square meters, a single bed shoved against the wall, a small table that served as both dining table and study desk, a battered old wardrobe with a door that didn't quite close right. The kitchenette and the bathroom shared the same corner, divided by a thin curtain. There was nothing of value in this apartment. No jewelry, no expensive electronics, nothing that suggested its owner had anything except poverty. But on the wall across from her bed, there was one thing that caught Autumn's gaze. Her nursing diploma, carefully framed, hung in the most honored place in the room. It was the only thing she allowed herself to be proud of. It was proof of 6 years of struggle, 6 years of exhaustion, 6 years of refusing to surrender to fate, and now they were trying to take it from her. Dobbs dragged her toward the door, not gently, not with respect. Autumn walked with her back straight and her head high. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She didn't let them see fear, even though she was shaking inside. As she crossed the threshold, she looked back at the diploma on the wall one last time. Then she faced forward, meeting whatever waited ahead. Inside her head, a voice rose, her own voice, calm and unbreakable. I survived hell. I'll survive this. Dobbs dragged Autumn out of the building, his fingers clamped around her arm like iron pliers. The weak light of dawn fell on the empty street in Dorchester, where rows of worn old apartment buildings lined both sides like silent witnesses. The FBI's black SUV was parked right at the entrance, the rear door already open, waiting to swallow her into the dark. Dobbs shoved Autumn toward the vehicle, a triumphant smile on his mouth. He thought he'd won. He thought this was just another easy arrest, like all the others he'd carried out for Pemberton. A poor nurse with no family and no one to protect her. The perfect prey. Then he heard engines. Not one, not two. The sound of dozens of car engines roaring at once rolled in like thunder from both ends of the horizon. Dobbs stopped, head snapping toward the noise, eyes widening in disbelief. From both ends of the street, glossy black SUVs came tearing in at a blistering speed. 1, 2, 5, 10. They kept appearing, like an army driving into position. They slammed to a stop with squealing brakes, surrounding the FBI vehicle completely, sealing off every way out and every way in. Dobbs yanked out his gun and shouted orders at his team, but his voice shook, the confidence from seconds ago gone. The other 5 FBI agents drew their weapons too, forming a defensive ring around Autumn and Dobbs. They were trained for danger, but they'd never faced anything like this. The doors of the black SUVs opened at the same time, like a performance that had been rehearsed. Men stepped out, one by one, silent and orderly. They wore black suits and crisp white shirts. Their faces were stone cold, blank, unreadable. They didn't draw guns. They didn't need to. Their presence alone turned the quiet street into an unbreakable fortress. Autumn counted at least 30 of them, maybe more, standing in a circle around the FBI like living statues. One man broke away from the crowd and walked forward with a confidence that carried authority. Autumn recognized him instantly, even though she'd never met him before. Silas, the right hand of someone very, very powerful. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp angles to his face and a scar running from his temple down across his cheekbone. He stopped directly between Autumn and Dobbs, like a steel wall separating prey from hunter. "What the hell are you doing?" Dobbs shouted, gun pointed at Silas. "This is an FBI operation. You're obstructing federal justice." Silas didn't answer. He simply stood there, looking at Dobbs the way you looked at an insect, not worth the effort. His silence was more frightening than any threat. Then another voice cut in, calm and heavy with command. "Agent Dobbs, I suggest you lower your weapon before the situation becomes more complicated." Another man stepped out from one of the SUVs. He looked about 50, salt and pepper hair combed neatly back, with the sharp face of someone accustomed to hard legal wars. He wore an expensive gray suit, a black leather briefcase in his hand, and he moved with the confidence of a man who knew he held all the cards. "Who are you?" Dobbs demanded, still trying to sound aggressive, but most of the force had drained out of it. "Raymond Pierce," the man replied, offering a business card. "Miss Hayes' attorney. And before you ask, yes, she has an attorney, even if she didn't know it until this moment." He opened the briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents. "I've reviewed your warrant, Agent Dobbs. There are some procedural issues I think you should be aware of." "That warrant is completely valid," Dobbs snarled. "Is it?" Raymond lifted an eyebrow and flipped the file open. It was signed by Judge Morrison at 3 a.m, only 4 hours after the application was submitted. That's rather fast, don't you think? Also, the primary evidence used to obtain the warrant is a report of opioid theft, but I have in my possession Street Catherine Hospital's pharmacy inventory records showing there's been no shortage at all over the past 6 months. He snapped the file shut with a deliberate final sound. "I could continue, but I think you understand the problem." Dobbs went silent, his face draining pale. He looked around at the 30 men standing like statues, at Raymond Pierce with the documents in his hand, at Silas still planted between him and Autumn. He understood he'd lost, at least this round. "Miss Hayes will cooperate with the investigation," Raymond said, his voice even and leaving no room to bargain. "She'll go to the police station to answer questions, but she'll go in my vehicle, and with me present as her attorney. That's her right, and I'm sure you don't want to violate the rights of an American citizen in front of this many witnesses." Dobbs clenched his jaw, but he had no other choice. He gave a sharp nod and signaled his team to lower their weapons. Silas stepped aside, clearing the way as Raymond guided Autumn toward one of the black SUVs. The handcuffs were still locked around her wrists, but everything about the handling had changed. Raymond opened the door for her gently, as if inviting an honored guest. Autumn slid inside. The door closed behind her, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she could breathe. The vehicle pulled away, leaving the street behind, while Dobbs and the FBI team stood there amid the men in black suits. Autumn stared out through the window, watching the black SUVs peel off one by one, dispersing like ghosts dissolving into daylight. She didn't understand what had just happened. She didn't understand why she had a lawyer she'd never hired. She didn't understand who the men in black suits were, why they'd appeared, why they were protecting her. In her mind, one question kept repeating, with no answer in sight. Who's protecting me? The holding room at the Boston police station was cold and bare. 4 dull gray walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs facing each other, and a flickering fluorescent light overhead. Autumn had been sitting alone in that room for nearly 3 hours. The handcuffs had been removed, but the icy memory of the metal still seemed stamped into her wrists. Raymond Pierce had stayed with her through the entire questioning, answering for her when he decided a question was inappropriate, cutting the agents off when they tried to corner her. He was good, very good, but he still hadn't explained why he was here, why he was protecting her, who had hired him. And Autumn still hadn't asked. She'd learned a long time ago that sometimes silence was the best weapon. Raymond had stepped out 15 minutes earlier, saying he needed to take care of some paperwork. He'd promised he'd be back soon, and Autumn sat there alone, staring at the gray wall in front of her, trying to piece together the chaos in her head. Hargrove, Pemberton, the FBI, the warrant, the men in black suits, Raymond Pierce. It all spun through her mind like a cyclone, and she couldn't find where it began or where it ended. Then the steel door opened. Autumn lifted her head, thinking Raymond had returned. But the man who walked in wasn't Raymond. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with black hair cut close and neat. He wore a black suit and a white shirt without a wrinkle, as if he'd stepped straight off the cover of a high-end magazine. But it wasn't the clothes that caught Autumn. It was the eyes. Gray, cold as steel, sharp as a blade, looking straight at her with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. And the tattoos. Black ink ran along his neck and across his hands, telling a story of violence and power she didn't need to read to understand. Autumn knew who he was immediately. Memory slammed into her like a wave. The rain-soaked night 6 months ago. The dark alley. Blood. Rain. Gray eyes watching her through the curtain of water, suspicious and startled all at once. She remembered him asking her name. She remembered turning away without answering. The man closed the door behind him and stepped into the room with a quiet confidence that carried authority. His presence filled the small space, making the air feel heavier, tighter. He pulled out the chair across from Autumn, sat down, and placed both hands on the metal table. The tattoos stood out under the flickering light. "You remember me," he said. Not a question. A statement. Autumn nodded slowly. "You were the man in the alley. 6 months ago." "Cade Blackwood," he said, as if the name explained everything. And maybe it did, to anyone who knew Boston's underworld, but Autumn didn't belong to that world. She was just a poor nurse, an orphan who had dragged herself out of the dark. She didn't know who Cade Blackwood was, didn't know about the Blackwood Syndicate, didn't know about the empire he'd built, but she knew one thing. He was dangerous, extremely dangerous. "Why are you here?" Autumn asked, her voice calmer than she expected. Cade studied her for a long moment before he answered. "Because you saved my life, and in my world, that creates a debt. I didn't save you so I could collect." "I know," Cade nodded. "That's why this debt weighs more than any I've ever carried." He paused, gray eyes still locked on hers. "In my world, no one helps anyone without wanting something in return. No one. Everything is a transaction. Every kindness has a price. But you knelt in the rain and saved a stranger bleeding to death. And then you vanished without needing to know my name, without needing to know what I could give you. You were the first person to do that, the only one." Autumn didn't speak. She just watched him, trying to understand the man sitting in front of her. "Hargrove and Pemberton think they can touch you, and never pay for it," Cade continued, his voice lower, colder. "They think you've got no one protecting you. They're wrong." He leaned forward, his gaze a knife. "You're safe, Autumn. From this moment on, no one's going to lay a hand on you again. The war has only just started, and when it ends, Hargrove will lose everything he has." Autumn looked at him in silence for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice steady, not trembling, not afraid, only carrying the blunt honesty she'd carried all her life. "I don't need anyone to save me." Cade lifted an eyebrow, surprised by her reaction. "I've saved myself for 27 years, Autumn went on. "I don't need some knight in an expensive suit showing up to fix things for me. I'm not a princess in a tower waiting to be rescued." She stopped and drew a long breath. Then she added, her voice softer, but no less firm. "But thank you for being here." Cade looked at her, and for the first time, the corner of his mouth shifted. Not quite a smile, just a small lift, almost too subtle to notice. But it was there, a hairline crack in the wall of ice he'd built around himself. "You're different, Autumn Hayes," Cade said, and there was something in his tone she couldn't quite name. "Very different. Somewhere in the city of Boston, in a basement with no address, no windows, and nothing on the outside to suggest a human being lived within it, a shadow sat before dozens of glowing computer screens. The room was drowned in darkness, lit only by the cold blue wash of the monitors across the face of the person sitting there. No one knew what Ghost looked like. No one knew his real name, how old he was, or where he came from. Even Cade Blackwood, who had used his services for years, had never met him in person. Ghost was a phantom in the digital world, a legend in the underground hacking scene, a name that made technology, corporations, and government agencies shudder. And for the past 48 hours, that phantom had not slept. Ghost's fingers hammered the keys like a madman, his eyes scanning line after line of code, layer after layer of security, wall after wall of fire he needed to break through. Street, Catherine Hospital's servers, Malcolm Hargrove's private email, Richard Pemberton's hidden bank accounts, confidential FBI records. Nothing was untouchable to Ghost. No secret could hide from him. And what he found over those 48 hours was more horrifying than even Cade had anticipated. The main screen displayed a long spreadsheet that seemed to scroll forever. 23 names. 23 patients who had died on an operating table or in recovery at St. Catherine Hospital over the past 10 years. 23 people whose medical records had been altered, whose causes of death had been changed, whose evidence of malpractice had been erased clean. Ghost compared the original files to the current ones, and the differences were as clear as daylight. Hargrove had cut in the wrong place. Hargrove had severed the wrong artery. Hargrove had left surgical instruments inside a patient's body. Each time, someone had stepped in and wiped the trail away, turning a killing into an unfortunate accident, turning a murderer into a tragic doctor who had tried his best but could not save the patient. Ghost opened another file. Bank transaction histories. $15 million had been moved from Pemberton's hidden accounts to 23 different families over 10 years. Hush money. Money to buy silence. Money to make fathers, mothers, and children swallow their grief and forget the truth. Some families received a few $100,000. Some received more. The amount depended on how severe the case was and how capable the family might be of causing trouble. Pemberton was very good at putting a price on silence. Ghost kept scrolling, and then he stopped. A name that made even him, a man who had seen far too much of the world's darkness, hold his breath. Emily Carter, 8 years old, date of death 7 years ago. Ghost opened her file and read every line, his eyes growing colder with each one. Emily Carter had been admitted for appendicitis, a simple surgery any first-year resident could perform. But Hargrove had operated, and Hargrove had been drunk. He cut into the small intestine instead of the appendix. The 8-year-old bled to death on the table while Hargrove staggered, trying to correct his own mistake. The original record stated it clearly, the surgeon's blood alcohol level at the time of the incident. The current record contained nothing of the sort, not a single line. Emily Carter's family received $2 million and a confidentiality agreement 30 pages thick. Ghost stared at Emily Carter's photograph in the file. A little girl with bright blonde hair, vivid blue eyes, and a wide grin that showed the gaps where baby teeth were missing. 8 years old. Only 8. She should have been running, going to school, growing up, being loved, living. But because a drunk man held a scalpel in his hand, she lost everything. And the man who killed her was still walking free, still operating on patients, still being called a doctor. Ghost opened an encrypted chat window and typed a message to Cade Blackwood. Done. Attaching all files, 23 victims, 10 years of cover-ups, $15 million in hush money, emails, bank transactions, original records, and altered records. Everything has verifiable sources, enough to bury him and his friends. He paused for a second, then typed more. There is an 8-year-old girl on the list. Emily Carter. Hargrove cut the wrong place while drunk. Family took $2 million to stay silent. One more line. I don't usually feel anything about the work, but this time, I hope boss makes him pay what he owes. Ghost hit send, then leaned back in his chair and watched the dozens of screens flicker in front of him. He had done his part. He had dug up every secret Hargrove and Pemberton had buried over 10 years. Now it was Cade Blackwood's turn to use those secrets. And Ghost knew that when Cade moved, there would be nowhere left in this world for Hargrove to hide. That same night, as Ghost sent off files packed with Hargrove's darkest secrets, another uprising was quietly taking shape inside the very heart of St. Catherine Hospital. The clock read 11 at night, and the basement corridor was empty and cold, filled only with the faint buzz of fluorescent lights and the slow drip of water somewhere in the dark. 3 figures moved like apparitions, footsteps soft, breaths held, hearts pounding hard against their ribs. Janet Lewis led the way. Behind her was Brenda Collins, the head nurse who had worked in this hospital for 20 years. And last came Mike Chen, a 26-year-old IT tech with messy hair and bright eyes behind thick glasses. They weren't heroes. They were ordinary people who were tired of silence. Janet stopped at the steel door to the underground archive, where old records sat forgotten for years. She pulled out a key card Brenda had secretly copied from the security office and swiped it across the reader. A green light blinked, and the door opened with a creak that made all 3 of them flinch. They slipped inside, pulled the door shut behind them, and the darkness swallowed them whole. Mike switched on his phone's flashlight and swept the beam across the room. Tall, metal shelves rose on either side, packed with dusty boxes of aging files, lined up like a maze of buried secrets. The smell of mildew and old paper hit Janet's nose, and she fought the urge to cough. Brenda didn't waste time. She knew exactly what she needed and exactly where it would be. For 10 years, she had quietly kept copies of handwritten notes about Hargrove's questionable surgeries, hiding them inside a box misfiled in the farthest corner of the archive. She'd been too afraid to speak, but her conscience wouldn't let her destroy the evidence completely. And now, after all those years of silence, she finally had a chance to use it. While Brenda searched for the box, Mike crouched in front of an old computer in the corner, its keyboard buried beneath a thick layer of dust. This was the hospital's former storage system, replaced 5 years ago, but no one had bothered to wipe the data still sitting inside it. Mike powered it on. The screen flickered a few times, then an outdated interface appeared. His fingers began to fly, slipping past weak security layers, digging for records Hargrove believed had been deleted long ago. He didn't know the old system still held backups. No one knew, except Mike, who had discovered it during server maintenance 3 months earlier. Janet stood near the door, keeping watch, ears straining for any sound outside. Her heart beat so fast she could hear it in her own ears. She thought about Autumn, the quiet coworker who always took the hardest shifts without complaint, who always protected new nurses when they made mistakes, who always stepped in to take the hit when Hargrove exploded. Autumn never asked for thanks. She simply did what was right, day after day, as if that was the only way she knew how to live. And when Autumn needed them most, they had looked away. Janet still remembered the shame of standing frozen, while Hargrove slapped Autumn, too frightened to say a single word. She wouldn't let that happen again. Suddenly, footsteps sounded in the hallway outside, heavy, steady, coming closer. Janet signaled Mike and Brenda, and all 3 of them killed the flashlight and held their breath in the dark. The footsteps stopped right outside the archive door. A beam of light slipped through the crack and swept across the room. Janet pressed herself against the shelving, feeling cold metal bite into her back. Brenda lay flat on the floor, clutching the file box to her chest. Mike stayed perfectly still under the desk, barely daring to breathe. Keys rattled. The door was opening. Janet moved on instinct. She stood up, stepped out of hiding, and yanked the door open wide before the guard could enter. The guard jerked back, his flashlight snapping up into her face. "What are you doing down here?" he demanded, suspicion thick in his voice. Janet smiled, a smile she prayed looked natural enough. "Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you. I'm looking for an old record for tonight's shift. We've got a patient who needs information from a previous admission." She held up her employee badge. "Janet Lewis, ER, you can check." The guard stared at her, then glanced at the pitch-black room behind her. Janet felt her heart slam so hard, it almost hurt. If he stepped inside, he'd see Mike and Brenda. Everything would be over. "It's dark," the guard said. "You should turn the lights on." "The lights are out," Janet answered quickly. "I was going to report it to maintenance in the morning. Anyway, I've got what I need." She stepped into the hallway and pulled the door closed behind her, cutting off any chance for him to look inside. "Thanks for checking. I need to get back to my shift." The guard watched her for a few seconds more, then gave a short nod and walked away. Janet stood still until his footsteps faded completely into the dark. Then she exhaled, knees nearly buckling with relief. 10 minutes later, the 3 of them left the archive carrying a file box and a USB drive packed with data. They didn't speak a word to each other until they reached the parking lot. There, a black SUV was waiting, its windows so dark you couldn't see through them. Janet stepped forward and handed a brown envelope filled with everything they'd found to the man standing beside the vehicle. He nodded without speaking, then disappeared into the SUV. The vehicle rolled away and melted into the night. Janet watched it go, something strange rising in her chest. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was doing something that mattered. Autumn always protected us, she thought. Now it's our turn. Cade Blackwood's office on the top floor of Blackwood Tower stayed lit all night. The room was vast, with floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over Boston wrapped in darkness, the streaks of streetlights and the glow from high-rise windows glittering like scattered stars. But Cade wasn't looking outside. He sat behind a massive black wood desk, a thick stack of documents in front of him, surrounded by dozens of people in expensive suits. Attorneys, financial advisors, mergers and acquisitions specialists. They had worked for 48 hours straight to finalize the biggest deal Cade had ever made. Not for profit, not to expand his empire, but for one purpose only, to destroy Malcolm Hargrove. Raymond Pierce stood beside Cade, a silver fountain pen in his hand. He set it down in front of Cade and pointed to the final line on the final page of the contract. "Sign here, Mr. Blackwood, and it's done." Cade picked up the pen and looked down at the paper. The acquisition agreement for Street, Catherine Medical Center, executed through a shell company called Eastwood Healthcare Holdings. A meaningless name. A paper company with no real address, no real staff, existing only to conceal the identity of the true owner. Cade had been quietly buying up the hospital's debt for 6 months, one account at a time, one creditor at a time, until he held nearly all of the crushing debt the hospital was carrying. The board didn't know. Hargrove didn't know. Pemberton didn't know. They only believed the hospital was struggling financially, that creditors were tightening the screws, that they needed a new investor to save them. And when Eastwood Healthcare Holdings appeared with a generous offer, they took the bait like hungry fish. Cade signed his name, the handwriting sharp and decisive. He set the pen down, leaned back in his chair, and fixed his steel-gray eyes on Raymond. Raymond smiled, the smile of a man who had just watched a flawless chess match unfold. "Congratulations, Mr. Blackwood. You are now the owner of Street Catherine Medical Center." The people in the room offered light applause, as if this were an ordinary business deal. But Cade didn't smile. He didn't clap. He simply sat there, face blank, eyes focused on nothing in particular. "I didn't buy a hospital," Cade said, his voice low and cold as ice. "I bought the right to destroy Hargrove." The room went silent. No one dared speak. They knew Cade Blackwood never joked, and they knew anyone who stood between him and his target would be crushed. Cade rose and walked to the window, looking down at Boston sleeping beneath him. He thought about Autumn, about the small nurse, sitting alone in some cold waiting room, waiting for a hearing that would decide her fate. She didn't know he had bought the entire hospital. She didn't know he had gathered enough evidence to bury Hargrove and Pemberton. She didn't know the war was close to ending, and that she would win. Cade turned to Silas, who stood silent in the corner like a shadow. "Silas." "Yes, boss." "Send someone to her. Bring food, something warm and nourishing, and bring a message from me." Silas nodded and pulled out his phone. "What message, boss?" Cade was quiet for a moment, gray eyes distant. Then he spoke, and his voice softened, gentler, as if the ice were beginning to melt. "You're not alone. Trust me." An hour later, in a small courthouse waiting room, Autumn sat by herself on a hard wooden bench. The hearing would begin in the morning, and she hadn't slept in nights. Raymond Pierce had assured her everything would be fine, but she didn't know how to believe it. She had lived long enough to know that justice didn't always stand with the right. The door opened, and a young woman stepped in carrying a paper bag and a small envelope. She set the bag on the table in front of Autumn, and the scent of hot soup and fresh bread drifted up. "Someone sent this for you," the woman said, then turned and left before Autumn could ask a single question. Autumn looked at the bag, then at the envelope. She opened it. Inside was a small piece of paper with neat handwriting. "You're not alone. Trust me." No signature. No signature was needed. She knew who it was from. Autumn held the note and read the short line again and again. "You're not alone." For the first time in 27 years, someone was telling her she wasn't alone. And for the first time in a very long time, her green eyes filled with tears, not from sadness, not from fear, but from a feeling she'd forgotten existed at all. The feeling of being cared for. The federal courtroom in Boston sat high inside the John Joseph Moakley building, a massive structure overlooking the harbor. That morning, courtroom 7 was packed to the walls. Cameras from major news outlets lined both sides, lenses aimed at the witness stand like hungry eyes. Reporters filled the back rows, fingers tapping nonstop on laptops, trying to capture every detail of a case that had seized the attention of the entire city. Expensive suits crowded the guest section. Familiar faces from Boston's upper crust, friends and allies of Hargrove and Pemberton, all here to witness the public execution of a small nurse who had dared to challenge their power. Autumn sat at the defense table, small and alone in the vast room. She wore a simple white blouse and black slacks, her auburn hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck. Raymond Pierce sat beside her, one hand resting on a thick stack of documents, his face calm as if he were attending an ordinary meeting, not a hearing whose outcome had been decided in advance. Autumn felt every stare drilling into her back, every whisper spreading through the room. She knew what they were saying about her. Drug thief, unstable employee, a danger to patients. The lies had been planted, and now they were blooming into a forest of poisoned thorns closing in on her from every side. Judge Harold Morrison sat high on the bench, a black robe draped over his heavy frame, a fleshy face with small eyes hiding behind gold-rimmed glasses. He had been Pemberton's golf buddy for 15 years, a regular guest at lavish parties, a man who had accepted more than a few favors from the powerful. Autumn looked at him and knew justice would not be found in this room. He wasn't a judge. He was an executioner, and the sentence had been written before the hearing ever began. Richard Pemberton sat in the first row on the prosecution side, an expensive three-piece gray suit, silver hair slicked neatly back, a smug smile never leaving his mouth. He looked at Autumn the way you looked at an insect about to be crushed under a heel, and she felt the contempt in his gaze like a cold wind passing through her. Then Hargrove took the stand. He wore a spotless white coat, as if he had stepped out of an operating room to come here. A calculated choice, meant to remind everyone that he was a doctor, a lifesaver, a symbol of nobility and sacrifice. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Then he began to perform. "I don't want to be here," Hargrove started, his voice sad and full of regret. "I tried to help Miss Ponning, Hayes. I gave her chances, again and again. But she refused help." He paused, sighed, eyes lowering as if he were carrying an enormous burden. "She's unstable. I recognized it early, but I hoped that with the right support, she could overcome it. I was wrong." The prosecutor nodded, encouraging him to go on. "Please describe the defendant's behavior in the weeks leading up to the incident." Hargrove lifted his head, a look of false concern turning toward Autumn. She became increasingly aggressive, defying doctors' orders, changing treatment plans on her own. "I heard she was taking medication from the pharmacy, but I didn't want to believe it. I thought maybe she was dealing with personal issues. Maybe she needed help, not punishment." He shook his head, his anguish so perfectly shaped it could fool anyone. "But that night, when she openly challenged me in front of the entire emergency room, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. I had to protect the patients. That's my duty." Pemberton nodded from the gallery, satisfaction widening his smile. Judge Morrison exchanged a glance with him, a nod so small it was almost invisible, like two wolves dividing a meal. Autumn felt sweat gathering in her palms, felt her heart beating out of rhythm in her chest. She knew she was losing. She knew that no matter how skilled Raymond Pierce was, he couldn't win a game where the referee had been bought. But in the last row of the courtroom, a man sat in silence, motionless as a statue. Cade Blackwood wore a black suit and an immaculate white shirt. His gray eyes weren't on Hargrove, weren't on the judge, weren't on Pemberton. They were on Autumn, only Autumn, with an expression no one could read. In his hand was a thin tablet, its screen lit, showing a single, simple button. He only had to press it, and everything would change. But not yet. He was waiting for the perfect moment, waiting for Hargrove and Pemberton to believe they had won, before he brought their entire world crashing down. Hargrove kept talking, voice thick with manufactured emotion, describing sleepless nights, worrying about patients, the weight of having to report a coworker, the pain of testifying against someone he had tried to help. His performance was flawless enough to deceive anyone who didn't know the truth. But Cade knew the truth, and the truth was about to be dragged into the light. Hargrove finished his testimony with a dramatic sigh, as if he'd just completed a painful but necessary duty. He stepped down from the witness stand, shot Autumn a look of open triumph, then returned to his seat beside his attorney. The courtroom fell silent, a heavy silence that felt like a warning of something awful about to happen. Judge Morrison cleared his throat, his small eyes sweeping the room once before settling on Autumn. He opened his mouth, ready to deliver the ruling everyone already knew had been written long before this morning. Then the large doors at the back of the courtroom slammed open with a thunderous bang. Every head turned, every breath stopped, and they saw him. Cade Blackwood walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, his pace unhurried but carrying absolute authority, like a king stepping into his own territory. The sound of his leather shoes striking marble echoed through the silence, like a countdown, like war drums announcing a battle about to begin. He wore a black suit and a white shirt, the tattoos on his neck and hands stark beneath the bright courtroom lights. His gray eyes were cold as steel, sweeping the room with undisguised contempt. Two court officers rushed toward him, hands reaching for the tasers at their belts. But they didn't make it close. They stopped, frozen in place like statues. Not because Cade said anything, not because he did anything, only because of his eyes. The eyes of a man who had killed and was willing to kill again. The eyes of a predator measuring prey. The officers stepped back, survival instinct telling them this wasn't a man they could face. "This is a closed hearing," Judge Morrison shouted, his fleshy face turning red with anger and fear. "You have no right to be here. Security, remove this man immediately." Cade didn't stop. He kept walking, those leather shoes tapping a steady rhythm on the floor, until he stood directly in front of the bench. He looked up at Morrison the way you looked at an insect. Then he slammed a leather briefcase down on the judge's desk with a hard, final thud. "I have every right to be here," Cade said, his voice low and cold as ice, carrying through the courtroom. "While you've been taking bribes from Pemberton and playing golf on the weekends, I've been buying Hargrove's hospital." The room erupted into a storm of murmurs. Reporters hammered their keys like mad. Cameras swung toward Cade, capturing every second. Pemberton shot to his feet, his face drained white. Hargrove sat frozen, mouth hanging open as if someone had punched him in the gut. Raymond Pierce stood, walked to Cade's side with a calm smile, opened the briefcase, pulled out a thick stack of documents, and began to read aloud, his voice clear, every word precise. "The purchase and transfer agreement for Street Catherine Medical Center, effective as of yesterday." Raymond held up the first page. Buyer, Eastwood Healthcare Holdings, a wholly owned subsidiary of Blackwood Holdings. He lifted the second page. Owner and Chief Executive Officer of Blackwood Holdings, Cade Blackwood. He placed both pages on the judge's desk. "Which means, Your Honor, the man standing before you is the lawful owner of Street Catherine Hospital. He has the right to access all hospital records, the right to testify as an interested party, and the right to request that this court reconsider the evidence in this case." Judge Morrison swallowed hard, his face shifting from red to a sickly white in seconds. He looked toward Pemberton for help, but Pemberton stood there like a man staring at a ghost. Hargrove was trembling now, hands gripping the arms of his chair until his knuckles turned white. Cade turned to look at Hargrove, gray eyes locking onto the doctor's panicked stare. He didn't speak. He only looked, a look sharp enough to make Hargrove shrink in his seat. Then Cade faced the bench again, his voice rising with calm authority. "I request to call a new witness." Judge Morrison stammered. Who is the witness?" Cade's mouth lifted into a cold smile that never reached his eyes. "Me." Cade stepped up to the witness stand, but he didn't sit. He stood there, tall and commanding, looking out over the entire courtroom the way a king looks down on his subjects. Then he signaled, a small motion with one finger, and everything changed. The large screen behind the judge's bench flashed to life. The lights in the courtroom dimmed automatically, as if someone had programmed this moment in advance. And on the screen, a list began to scroll, slowly, one line at a time. Name, age, date of death, original cause of death, altered cause of death, hush money paid. James Morrison, 57 years old, died on the 12th of March, 2015. Original cause, the aorta severed during heart surgery. Altered cause, unforeseen complications. Hush money, $500,000. Linda Chen, 42 years old, died on the 21st of August, 2016. Original cause, a surgical clamp left inside the abdomen. Altered cause, post-operative infection. Hush money, $750,000. The list kept scrolling. 23 names, 23 lives cut short, 23 families bought into silence. The courtroom sank into absolute quiet, broken only by someone's ragged breathing and the frantic clatter of reporters typing. Then the screen shifted to emails. From Malcolm Hargrove to Richard Pemberton, dated the 15th of September, 2018. "We've got a problem to handle. Patient Thompson didn't make it. The family is asking questions. We need to move fast." Pemberton's reply. "Understood. I'll have someone contact the family. Standard amount. Or do we need higher?" Hargrove answered. "Higher. They have an attorney." Another email. From an anonymous account belonging to a billionaire on the hospital's board. "Malcolm, you need to be more careful. This is the 3rd time this year. If this gets out, we all go under." Hargrove replied. "Don't worry. Richard has handled everything. No one's going to talk." Pemberton shot to his feet, face white as a corpse, eyes wild as he searched for an exit. He turned, lunging toward the back doors of the courtroom. But the doors were closed, and standing in front of them were 2 men in black suits, Cade's people. Faces cold as stone, arms folded across their chests. Pemberton stopped, as if his feet had been nailed to the floor, realizing he'd been trapped inside the very snare he believed he'd set for someone else. The screen kept playing. Then a photograph appeared. A little girl with bright blonde hair, vivid blue eyes, and a wide grin that showed the gaps where baby teeth were missing. Emily Carter, 8 years old. Date of birth, the 12th of April, 2010. Date of death, the 23rd of July, 2018. Original cause of death, the small intestine cut instead of the appendix, surgeon's blood alcohol level above the legal limit, altered cause of death, a rare allergic reaction to anesthesia, hush money, $2 million. The courtroom erupted. Someone began to sob, the sound raw and tearing through the air from the gallery. A middle-aged woman stood up, tears streaming down her face, her mouth stammering her daughter's name, Emily Carter's mother. She had been sitting through the entire hearing without knowing the truth about her child's death was about to be exposed. She collapsed back into her seat, her body shaking with grief and rage as people around her tried to hold her up. Hargrove leapt to his feet, his face flushed red with fear and fury, pointing at the screen. "This is a conspiracy," he screamed, his voice shrill and frantic. "Fabricated evidence. All of it is fabricated. That man is a criminal. He's a mafia boss. Why would you believe him?" Cade didn't shout back. He didn't need to. He stepped down from the stand and walked straight toward Hargrove, each step slow and threatening. He stopped right in front of the doctor, close enough that Hargrove could see the fire burning in those steel-gray eyes. "Every file has a verifiable origin," Cade said, his voice low and cold as ice, each word landing like drops of acid. "Every email has an IP trail. Every bank transfer has a transaction history. Every medical record has an original and an altered version for comparison." He tilted his head, looking at Hargrove the way you looked at a worm. "You want to verify it? Verify it. I've got a full team of digital forensics specialists ready to confirm every single byte. You want to call the FBI? Call them. But I suggest you call the real FBI, not bought dogs like Frank Dobbs." Hargrove stumbled backward, tripping over a chair, nearly falling. He looked around for help, but no one met his gaze. His attorney was packing up, preparing to leave. Pemberton was hunched in a corner, his face the color of ash. Judge Morrison was trembling on the bench, sweat pouring down his forehead. No one was going to save Hargrove. No one could save him. The wall of power he'd built over 10 years was collapsing, and he was about to be buried under the rubble. The main doors of the courtroom burst open again, and this time it wasn't Cade's men who came in. It was the Massachusetts State Police, dozens of them in dark blue uniforms, guns holstered, handcuffs glinting under the lights. They moved in a tight, professional formation, as if this moment had been rehearsed in advance. And right behind them came men in black jackets with FBI printed in large letters across the back, but not Frank Dobbs and not the ones who'd been bought. This was the real FBI, agents from the Federal Anti-Corruption Office, the ones who had received the full dossier from Cade Blackwood only hours before the hearing began. The state police commander walked straight to Hargrove, voice loud and final. "Malcolm Hargrove, you're under arrest for second-degree murder, destruction of evidence, and conspiracy to engage in organized corruption. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Hargrove didn't resist. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He simply stood there, knees shaking as if they might buckle, face white as a corpse, eyes empty and fixed on nothing. In less than a minute, he seemed to age 10 years. His hair looked grayer, the lines on his face deeper, his whole body shrinking under the weight of what he'd done over 10 years. When the cold handcuffs snapped around his wrists, he didn't look at anyone. He only lowered his head, like an animal finally and completely beaten. Across the courtroom, Pemberton was trying to get away. He shoved at people, his voice rising into a shrill, frantic scream. "You can't do this to me. I'm a United States Senator. I have immunity. This is unconstitutional." An FBI agent stepped in front of Pemberton, face like stone, voice calm but carrying authority. "Richard Pemberton, you're under arrest for treason, bribery, and conspiracy to cover up 23 murders. Senatorial immunity does not apply to treason, sir." The agent put weight on the last word, with open, unapologetic contempt. "You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it." Pemberton was cuffed and led away, still babbling threats about lawyers and lawsuits. But no one listened. No one cared. The power he'd swung around for years had turned to dust. He was just another criminal being marched out like any other. Judge Morrison sat on the bench, sweat pouring down his forehead, hands trembling so badly he couldn't hold his gavel. He looked down at the courtroom, at Hargrove being taken away, at Pemberton, screaming in panic, at Cade Blackwood standing like a statue in the middle of the chaos, and he knew that if he didn't act now, he would be next. The court declares," Morrison stammered, voice shaking as if he might cry. "All charges against Autumn Hayes are dismissed in full. Miss Hayes's nursing license is reinstated effective immediately. The court formally apologizes to Miss Performally Hayes for procedural failures in this case. The courtroom exploded. Applause rose from the back rows, where Janet, Brenda, Mike, and other co-workers from Street Catherine were sitting. They had come to support Autumn, even knowing it might cost them their jobs. But now, hearing the judge's declaration, they couldn't hold it in. Janet was the first to stand, rushing toward the defense table, tears streaming down her face. Brenda followed, then Mike, then the others. They wrapped Autumn in their arms, a circle of protection, their tears falling onto her shoulders. Autumn stood inside that embrace, surrounded by friends and co-workers who had finally dared to stand up for her. She felt their warmth. She felt a kind of care she'd never believed she deserved. And for the first time after everything that had happened, for the first time after 27 years of telling herself she had to be strong, for the first time since she'd been a 3-day-old baby left at the gates of an orphanage, Autumn Hayes cried. Not tears of pain, not tears of fear, but tears of happiness, of relief, of someone finally being released from the dark. The courtroom slowly emptied. The officers had led Hargrove and Pemberton away. The reporters had packed up their equipment and filed out. Judge Morrison had vanished through the back door, likely to face an investigation of his own. Janet, Brenda, Mike, and the other co-workers had left too, after hugging Autumn one last time, promising they would see her again at the hospital. Now the vast room held only silence and late afternoon sunlight pouring through the tall glass, laying warm gold streaks across the marble floor. Autumn stood alone by the window, looking out at Boston Harbor shimmering under the sunset. She wasn't thinking about Hargrove or Pemberton. She wasn't thinking about the dark days that had just passed. She simply stood there and breathed, feeling freedom expand in her chest. For the first time in a long time, she felt light. For the first time in a long time, she felt peace. Footsteps sounded behind her, slow and steady. Autumn didn't need to turn around to know who it was. She had learned the rhythm of those steps, the leather soles tapping the floor like the heartbeat of something strong and certain. Cade Blackwood stopped a few paces away, standing in the afternoon light, his black suit still impeccable, his dark hair still neat, as if he'd just come from an ordinary meeting and not a hearing that had toppled an entire criminal empire. But something was different in his gray eyes. They weren't cold like steel anymore. They weren't sharp like a blade anymore. In them now was something softer, something warmer, respect, admiration, and maybe, just maybe, something more. Autumn turned and faced him. They looked at each other in silence, two people from completely different worlds who had somehow found each other between darkness and rain, between blood and tears. Then Cade did something no one, not even Silas, who had followed him for 10 years, had ever seen him do. The most powerful Mafia boss on the East Coast, the man the entire underworld feared, slowly bowed his head to Autumn Hayes. A deep bow, formal, full of respect. Not the bow of an employer to an employee, not the bow of a debtor to a creditor, but the bow of a man before a woman he genuinely admired. "The debt is paid," Cade said as he lifted his head, his voice low and warmer than usual. "You saved my life 6 months ago. Now I protected you. We're even." Autumn looked at him, green eyes catching the sunset light. "Thank you," she said simply. "For everything." Cade nodded, then fell silent for a moment, as if weighing something. This wasn't a man used to hesitation. This wasn't a man used to not knowing what to say. But in front of Autumn, he seemed to become someone else. Someone more real, more human. "The debt is paid," Cade repeated, softer now. "But," he stopped, gray eyes meeting hers without flinching, without hiding. "I think I want to stay, if you'll allow it." Autumn looked at him, the man who had entered her life like a storm, who had protected her when no one else dared to stand up, who had bought an entire hospital just to make sure she would be safe. She didn't know what the future would look like. She didn't know where anything between them might lead. But she knew one thing. For the first time in her life, she didn't want to be alone anymore. Her lips curved, the first smile in what felt like forever. A small, honest smile, gentle and unguarded. She didn't answer with words. She only nodded once. And that was all Cade needed. 1 week later, Autumn Hayes walked through the main gates of Street Catherine Hospital. She wore a brand new nurse's uniform, her auburn hair neatly tied back, her green eyes bright. The hospital now belonged to Cade Blackwood, and the changes had begun. A new director had been appointed. A new board had been formed. The accomplices who had protected Hargrove had been fired. And Autumn Hayes had been invited back with a higher position, better pay, and an official apology from leadership. But what surprised Autumn most wasn't the changes. It was what waited for her the moment she stepped into the main corridor. Her co-workers stood lined up along both sides: Janet, Brenda, Mike, and dozens of others she had worked with for 3 years. When she appeared, they began to clap. The applause rolled down the hallway like a welcome song for a hero coming home. Autumn walked between the 2 lines of people, head high, back straight, a radiant smile on her face. She looked at the familiar faces, at the eyes filled with respect and affection, and she understood she wasn't the invisible nurse everyone forgot anymore. She was Autumn Hayes, the woman who had stood up to injustice, who had refused to bow to power, who had proven that no matter where you come from, no matter what you have in your hands, you can still change your own fate. And for the first time in 27 years, since she had been a 3-day-old baby left at an orphanage gate, Autumn Hayes knew she wasn't alone anymore. She had friends, she had co-workers, she had people willing to stand up for her, and she had one man who came from the dark world, but had brought her light. This story teaches us that kindness is never forgotten. A small act of mercy, like stopping to help a stranger in a dark alley, can change your entire life. It also reminds us that power and money aren't everything. Hargrove and Pemberton had everything the world calls success, and they lost it all to their own greed and cruelty. Meanwhile, Autumn, an orphaned girl with nothing but a kind heart and an unbreakable will, won. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and share it so more people can hear it. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss more moving stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever faced injustice in your life? And how did you get through it? Share with us in the comments below. We'd truly love to hear what's in your heart. I wish all of you watching this video strong health, a joyful life, and peace each day. Thank you for staying with us until the final minute. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.